a table where history was rewritten. Some moments in history happen in courts, parliaments, or public squares. But every so often, a moment arrives quietly, unfolding around a table where strangers gather, unaware that the future is shifting beneath their fingertips. This is the story of a restaurant so unassuming, so ordinary at first glance, that no one would imagine it would become the meeting place that altered the course of an entire region. It began during a time of deep tension. Communities were divided by politics, culture, and fear. Conversations grew brittle. Families avoided difficult topics. Neighbors who once greeted each other with warmth now crossed the street in silence. The region felt like a fragile vessel, one fracture away from breaking. People craved understanding but found only noise. And into this fractured world stepped a restaurateur who believed a shared meal could become a bridge where words alone had failed. He opened his restaurant on the edge of a quiet square, a modest space with only a handful of tables, mismatched chairs, and a menu inspired by the foods passed down through generations. There was nothing extraordinary about the dishes themselves. They were simple, comforting, familiar, but the atmosphere carried something rare, a feeling of safety. To understand why this restaurant became a turning point in history, we must return to the night everything changed. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that keeps people indoors. Yet 3 groups arrived separately, each unaware of the others: political rivals, cultural leaders, and a journalist who had spent months documenting the region's divides. They settled at different tables, their presence heavy with unspoken conflict. The restaurateur sensed the tension like a pulse in the air. Rather than separate them further, he did something unexpected. He served them a shared dish, an old recipe meant for communal gatherings, traditionally eaten from the same platter. As he placed it before them, he simply said, "Some meals are meant to be shared." At first, they resisted, but hunger, curiosity, and the quiet warmth of the dining room softened their resistance. They tasted the dish. Then they spoke, slowly at first, carefully, but as minutes slipped into hours, the conversation deepened, weaving honesty where defensiveness once stood. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, history quietly began to shift. The restaurateur didn't know it yet, but that night would echo far beyond the walls of his modest dining room. It would soon become the first spark in a story that would reshape a region desperate for connection. What happened after that unexpected conversation became the talk of the restaurant for weeks. The 3 groups, once unable to sit in the same room without tension, left that night with a softness none of them anticipated. They didn't agree on everything. They didn't solve their conflicts. But they had spoken. They had listened. And that alone felt revolutionary in a time when dialogue itself had nearly collapsed. Word of the encounter spread, quietly at first, passed from one diner to another like a whispered secret. People came not for spectacle, but for the possibility, remote, fragile, precious, that a meal could help them reconnect. Soon the restaurant became known as a place where difficult conversations found a gentler edge. Community members who hadn't shared a table in years returned to one another in cautious hope. But with this newfound attention came uncertainty. Some leaders criticized the restaurant, accusing it of meddling in affairs beyond its purpose. Others feared that bringing rivals together might backfire, creating even deeper rifts if tensions escalated. The restaurateur felt the pressure mounting, though he never asked for any of it. He wanted only to serve food that carried the warmth of his heritage. Yet, somehow, the world was asking him to carry more. Inside the dining room, subtle conflicts began to emerge. Groups arrived expecting transformation, as if a single dish could dissolve decades of disagreement. When conversations turned uncomfortable, some blamed the restaurant. When meetings didn't go as planned, others accused the restaurateur of choosing sides. The staff could feel the tension rising like heat in the kitchen. Tables that once hummed with cautious optimism now carried a weight of unresolved expectation. Despite this, profound moments continued to unfold. One evening, a former activist and a retired official, 2 people whose lives had been defined by opposing visions, found themselves seated only a few feet apart. They exchanged glances marked by decades of distrust. The restaurateur hesitated but followed his instinct. He served them the same shared dish that had sparked the first unlikely conversation. To his surprise, they began speaking, tentatively, awkwardly. But by the time dessert arrived, their rigid postures had softened. Still, these small triumphs carried a cost. Some diners accused the restaurant of fostering division by bringing conflicting groups together. Others claimed it was romanticizing reconciliation, oversimplifying complexity of real social fractures. The restaurateur found himself caught between praise and criticism, between hope and fear. Each night, he wondered whether he was helping or merely stepping into the turbulence of forces beyond his control. Yet beneath the noise, the dining room continued to do what it did best: offer a place where people could slow down enough to try again. The restaurateur didn't pretend to have answers. He simply believed that listening with a full stomach was easier than listening with an empty one. It was humble, imperfect, and perhaps naive. But night after night, it worked more often than it failed. And then came the evening that changed everything. The night when a high-ranking official and a prominent activist agreed to sit at the same table. Cameras followed. Crowds gathered outside. The staff trembled with nerves. If the conversation collapsed, the restaurant's fragile reputation might collapse with it. But if it worked, it could alter the trajectory of the region in ways no one could foresee. The emotional stakes had risen. The next moments would determine whether the dining room remained a symbol of hope or became a casualty of the conflict it tried to soothe. The night of the long-awaited meeting arrived with a tension so sharp it seemed to vibrate in the air. The dining room was fully booked, yet unusually quiet. Conversations were hushed. Forks moved cautiously, and even the clatter of plates from the kitchen felt subdued. Everyone understood that something significant was about to unfold. The restaurateur, steady but anxious, arranged the room with meticulous care, as though harmony could be coaxed into existence through placement alone. Then the two figures entered from opposite sides of the dining room. The high-ranking official, stern, composed, carrying the weight of bureaucracy. The prominent activist, fiery, outspoken, carrying the weight of generations demanding change. Their history was long, their disagreements legendary. They had shared stages, but never a table. And now, under the dim, warm light of this humble restaurant, they took their seats with guarded expressions, each bracing for a battle disguised as conversation. The restaurateur approached with a dish that had become the dining room's quiet symbol, a meal meant to be shared, served from a single platter. He placed it gently between them and stepped back. He offered no words, no instructions. The meaning was already understood. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, almost reluctantly, the official reached for a serving spoon. The activist followed. The first bites were taken in silence, the tension holding firm. But as the warmth of the dish settled in, the edges of their hostility began to soften. Not through agreement, but through the simple, grounding act of eating together. The conversation began stiffly, each sentence measured like a negotiation. They spoke of policy, protest, conflict, mistakes. They circled around old wounds, careful not to reopen them too quickly. But the dining room's rhythm worked its quiet influence. Dishes arrived unhurried. Time stretched. The space felt safe enough for vulnerability to slip through. Hours passed. Some diners left, casting long, hopeful glances at the table where history seemed to be stirring. Others stayed, pretending not to watch while witnessing every shift in posture, every softened tone, every unexpected moment of recognition. Then something changed. The activists shared a story, personal, raw, about a moment in their youth that shaped their lifelong fight. The official listened, really listened, the defensiveness draining from their eyes. Then the official spoke of a burden they had never admitted publicly, a mistake that had haunted their conscience for years. As they spoke, the activists leaned forward not in challenge, but in understanding. Walls cracked, then crumbled. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was human. The staff watched from the kitchen doorway, hardly breathing. The restaurateur felt something tighten in his chest. The realization that he was witnessing not victory, but possibility. But possibility, he knew, was fragile. As dessert was served, a small group gathered outside the restaurant, loud, angry, protesting the idea of dialogue rather than division. Their chants cut through the night, seeping into the dining room like a cold wind. The activists flinched, The official stiffened. The tension, once softened, tense again. And in that instant, the restaurateur understood that a meal could open a door, but keeping it open required courage far beyond what a dining room alone could provide. The night was drawing to its emotional peak. The next moments would decide whether the fragile progress made at this table would endure or shatter beneath the weight of voices demanding conflict instead of conversation. The chants outside grew louder, vibrating to the windows until every diner felt the weight of them. The official and the activist froze mid-conversation, their fragile connection trembling under the pressure of the world outside. The restaurateur stepped toward the door, instinctively wanting to protect the quiet space he had created. But he knew he could not silence a storm that had been gathering for years. The dining room held its breath. For a moment, it seemed everything would collapse. The activists pushed back their chair, ready to leave. The official looked down, their earlier openness retreating behind a wall of caution. The air thickened with the familiar tension of division, the very thing the restaurateur had spent years trying to ease. But then something unexpected happened. The activists paused. They looked at the official, really looked, and spoke in a voice worn thin by years of fighting. If we stop talking now, they win. The fear wins. The past wins. And I'm tired of the past deciding everything. The official raised their eyes, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Then let's finish our meal, they replied quietly, before the world tells us what we are allowed to be. The restaurateur felt a warmth rise in his chest. The staff exchanged stunned glances. The mood in the room shifted, not to triumph, but to resolve. The diners, sensing the moment, softened their own conversations, creating a cocoon of calm around the table where history struggled to rewrite itself. They continued eating, slowly, thoughtfully, like two people rediscovering the possibility of seeing one another without the armor of their roles. By the time dessert was finished, the chanting outside had faded. Some protesters left when they realized conflict wasn't erupting. Others stayed, confused by the lack of spectacle. Inside, the official and the activist stood to leave, not as allies, not as opponents, but as two people who had finally shared a moment of truth. Before walking out, the activist turned to the restaurateur. "You didn't solve anything tonight," they said softly, "but you reminded us that we're still capable of speaking to each other." The official nodded, adding, "And sometimes that's where history begins." The restaurateur watched them step into the night. Separate figures moving through the dimly lit square, carrying a quiet possibility that had not existed just hours earlier. The following weeks were turbulent. Media outlets debated the meaning of the meeting. Some praised the restaurant for fostering dialogue. Others accused it of staging spectacle. Protesters returned, and supporters formed protective circles around the dining room. Yet through it all, people kept coming, ordinary citizens who yearned for connection over conflict, conversation over accusation, humanity over noise. Slowly, something remarkable began to unfold. Community leaders requested tables for conversations they had avoided for years. Families fractured by ideology returned to sit together. Students organized dialogue nights. Elders shared stories lost time. The dining room became more than a restaurant. It became a space where people remembered that listening was not weakness, and speaking was not war. And though the restaurateur never sought recognition, the region eventually understood what had happened in that quiet space. History had not been rewritten in a single night, but it had shifted, one meal, one conversation, one fragile moment at a time. Because sometimes a table is more than a place to eat. Sometimes it becomes a place where a divided world begins to find its way back to itself. Subscribe to join the journey.